Hello and good afternoon and welcome everybody to the panel around data detectives, AI, ML, and data analytics in practice. So today what we're looking at doing is to kind of discuss the AI and ML topics and look at some practical ways and how we can implement them within our organizations. So really pleased to have a really fantastic panel here. We've got Luke Raven, who's the Senior Manager, AML Advisory. We've got Jeemeng Chen, who's Head of Financial Crime. And we've got Dr. Janet Bastiman, who's Chief Data Scientist. So maybe just a very quick round of introductions. Maybe, Janet, we go with you.
Hi, thank you. So yes, as you just said, I'm Chief Data Scientist at Napier, and we produce software that uses AI and machine learning in order to help fight financial crime and particularly spot money laundering activities.
Thanks very much. Maybe Jeemeng.
Hi, I'm Jeemeng here. I'm basically heading up the financial crime and regulatory compliance. So these are the two main pillars in any financial institution. Yeah.
Luke.
Rana, thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. My name's Luke Raven. I've been working in financial crime across banks and fintechs for approximately a little more than 12 years now, specializing in AML, and machine learning and AI is one of many exciting topics that I love to prattle on about.
Fantastic. Thanks, Luke. And my name is Ranadip. I'll be chairing the panel here. I'm Managing Director of Risk and Compliance at Protiviti, based in Singapore. So fantastic to have everyone from the audience here as well. Before we jump into the topic, I think everyone is quite familiar with AI and ML and some of the use cases around it. But I still feel that some of the precursors are lacking to really get into the artificial intelligence and machine learning and to get the real kind of meat out of it. So what are some of the precursors that we think we need? Do we need better data? Do we need more integrated systems to really get into kind of the topic? So maybe we can start with Janet, Dr. Janet, please.
Yes, so pretty much all of the above. So time and time again, I see people really wanting to expand their systems and implement AI technologies, but what they're missing is having that basic level of data sanity, for want of a better word. So they still have very siloed systems. They can't access all of the data they need to do. And the critical thing for any sort of AI system is it needs the data. It can't make good predictions for you unless it's got a broad set of information and the right information of high quality. So quite often we see mixed processes. So some of it is digitized. There's still some paper processes. We see teams who can only access very small subsets of data for a whole host of very good historical reasons, but that's been perpetuated, so they can't see the broader information that they need. And we also have problems with the data itself. So where information has been captured by somebody on hand and they've typed it in, you can have a lot of free text fields, and sometimes that can be difficult to split out accurately into really good, clean data sources that can then be used to train an AI or even be used for any sort of machine learning predictions. So one thing that I'd always say is you really need to get your basics right and make sure that you've got all of the data in place, centralized, where any such system can look at everything and it's good quality.
Outstanding. Thanks so much. Jeemeng, so I mean, is that kind of your experience as well? And maybe a bit of more of an insurance flavor to this topic?
Indeed so whether it is a bank or an insurance company, indeed there's a lot of interest into artificial intelligence. If you look in terms of Asia Pacific, some of the regulators around the world, primarily the HKMA, the MAS, had also focused a lot on the use of AI in different parts of compliance. Of course, one of these areas pertains more to financial crimes. So indeed, data is a very big issue, right? But there are other components in which sometimes as an institution, we may actually omit to focus on some of the nuances. Not to forget that a lot of the important element lies with the IT architecture. So most of these institutions who have been operating for many years, of course, systems get upgraded, but there is always this issue about legacy systems. When I talk about legacy systems, right, what it really means is in terms of certain information parameters, they are not there, not because there's an intention to omit them, but bear in mind in the past, even 10 years ago, when we designed a system, we may not necessarily have that financial crime perspective. So information are collated for example, to better data mine, for customer service experience, etc. But once you drill down into the nuances of financial crime, that is when you realize that, hey, I could be missing this part of the information, I could be missing some parts. And data quality is also another issue, right? Because you find that some data remains unremediated for many years. And some of these are for good reasons, because if then you go into the nuances of customer risk classification, sometimes certain low risk or standard risk, the profiles don't get updated, etc. And then there's many other things like data feed, etc. But pertaining to this, right, of course, I don't want to drill too much into it, but for any financial institution that wants to deploy AI apart from data and IT, thinking about models is very important, because there are different models available in AI, including the techniques used. Yeah. So I will stop short here without going into two technical parts of the modeling. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can save that for later, Jeemeng. So I think, you know, so Luke, I mean, in your kind of experience, you know, how do you actually get your kind of firm or regulated institutions ready for that whole AI ML journey?
Yeah, there's always a lot of talk about legacy systems, and that's very valid. But the other side of that is building for a minimum viable product and not necessarily putting compliance at the very center of everything you do from the start as a startup. So these are the things that you need to do as much as possible. I would say a single customer view is super important, and data lineage is obviously, as Jeemeng mentioned, can be really challenging and as Janet said, for a number of decent reasons when you look at the way things are, why they are that way, even in younger organizations sometimes. But that data quality and that single customer view is super important. If you don't, I would say that the AI and the ML, before you can get that in order, you really need to make sure that the well it's drawing from isn't poisoned. So make sure that you've got your data lineage. And if not, Jeemeng mentioned remediation. That's probably something that's good to really consider. The hygiene before you deploy any of these sort of technologically savvy solutions to tackle previously manual problems, you need to make sure that you've done your remediation and made sure that the data points are actually you know, reliable and relevant. And the last thing I'll say is manual processes. It's fantastic the amount of information that technically sits in a lot of institutions. That doesn't mean it's in a database nicely organized. A lot of the time it's in a PDF from, you know, 2016 when the customer first signed the form. So digitalizing that sort of information for ingestion into a more intelligent solution is a really big challenge, and building for that as much as you can will really set you up well, is my impression.
No, thanks. I mean, you make some really good points, Luke. And you know, just looking at the number of files, that hard copy files that banks still have and haven't been digitized is a good example of you know, how far we need to go. But also, I think, you know, what I would like to say is that we have made some strides as an industry in certain areas where we are using AI and ML, especially in the KYC onboarding, you know, screening and transaction monitoring space. I mean, what are some of the, you know, low-hanging fruits that you know, that the panel sees around, you know, the use of AI and ML, you know, across the kind of financial crime space? So again, Janet, maybe we start with you and then we go around the panelists.
Thank you. Yeah. So I mean, AI is particularly good at speeding up efficiency where you have complex but quite well-defined processes, or looking at new things that wouldn't be possible given human intervention. So we like to say it's like if you're looking for a needle in a haystack, you either want to remove the hay or make the needle bigger and easier to find. So from that point of view, some of the things that I think are particularly good to get started are things like screening. We know that when you're screening individuals and transactions, there are huge amounts of false positives, and it can be quite a big task to go through and check all of those manually. That's the sort of process that's absolutely ripe for automation with AI, whether fully automated or even as a recommendation system, so that you still have a human in the loop, something like that. And then from the other side, sort of the making the needles bigger. If you're looking at large volumes of transactions, you want to spot something unusual, something that's different from everything else that you've seen, whether that's different from that particular client that's sending you the transaction, or different when you're looking at your entire population. And that's something that just wouldn't be feasible to do that with a person sat in front of a computer, just because of the sheer volume of data they'd have to look at and compare. So those two things are the sorts of things that we like to look at as a first step, because they're relatively more straightforward to implement than some of the other AI systems that you can put in place, and they'll show that benefit straight away. So particularly in companies wanting to make that first step and make use, those two areas are where the data quality, as we've just discussed, is normally quite good, and they've got what they need digitized already to actually get some benefit in those areas.
Excellent. So Luke, you got any kind of additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. I think one area that's been flirting with AI and ML probably before it was cool, I think fraud has been something that's been really, especially fraud prevention on behalf of our customers, credit card fraud, account takeover, those types of things. And as obviously Janet said, the real low-hanging fruit here, because of the substantial amount of human effort that's spent on it, is screening. And the thing that I think these have in common, and I shouldn't confuse things, I don't think that machine learning and fraud has been, massively embedded, but they have like dynamic risk scoring and things like that, which are more along the line towards an AI ML approach than a static rule. And the thing that these have in common is, although the complexities of the inputs are really there, they're very complex, it's quite a binary outcome. Someone is a PEP or isn't a PEP. A payment is to a sanctioned jurisdiction or it isn't to a sanctioned jurisdiction. It is a fraudulent credit card transaction, or it's your customer's credit card transaction. So I think starting in those areas, that's one attribute. The more binary things are, in terms of the outcome, not necessarily the complexity to get there, that's a really great place to start. And I think that implementing anything along these kind of lines is a real journey for an organization. So I would start with the low-hanging fruit, as Janet said, to make sure that you learn the lessons along the way.
Yeah, and I think when the decision is binary, then the regulators generally find it easier to kind of sign off on the process, and once the machine starts making decisions, that's when the explainability of the AI and the ML algorithms need to be there. But Jeemeng, really keen to understand and hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yes, it's a very interesting proposition that you raise about which are the lower hanging areas that financial institutions can target at. I think this second proposition ties in with the first one, as we spoke about, right? The nuances that financial institutions should bear in mind if it wants to delve into AI. Basically, in terms of financial crime management, just offhand, right? AI can be used for as so-called as plain vanilla as the name screening processes. It can use for even a little bit more complex in terms of identification and verification. And that portion is very important because just for everybody's benefit, against the backdrop of the COVID and the pandemic, right? What used to be kind of exceptional, like non-face-to-face, is kind of getting more routine. And you get people onboarded via non-face-to-face platform. And one of those deployed architecture could be using AI as a means to verify certain documents. And last but not least, right, you have things which are transactional surveillance. But again, back to principle by saying that any institution who wants to implement full-fledged AI technologies, right, in either of these areas, right, cannot underestimate what it really takes to be, right. Just to quote an example, in a conventional, traditional form of, let's say, transactional surveillance, of course, your reviewer would have to get access to various sources, systems, could pull in data from everywhere. Now, the beauty of AI is such that, in fact, at the push of a few buttons, if you like, right, and if it's that sophisticated, you can basically have a very snapshot view as you required from different systems. And even it breaks down traditional boundaries of Chinese walls. If you go to very huge banks with different business units, because of the setup, systems, access, as well as information is all siloed. But conceptually, if you have got an AI, right, you are able to integrate different data sources such that your reviewer don't have to rush requests for information from different parties. And that sounds perfect in a real life kind of in an ideal situation. But putting into practice, whether the things are compatible in terms of data set and whether the systems can actually flow and map from one to another are very major considerations. Otherwise, conceptually, you can have an AI vendor who tells you, right, my system deliver 1 to 20. But insofar as your organization is concerned, right, because of all the limitations and because of all the costs that you have, right, out of the 20 options, right, I can only do for you about 6.5, and that limits, for example, the potential impact. Now, just last example, right, for those institutions, of course, they are doing trade-based money laundering. Documents are still hard copy. So unless your current systems are already optical character recognition enabled, otherwise you'll find that the documents that you scan in, right, you are basically relying on hard copy. Hopefully you don't do too much printouts. Even from a system perspective, right, you end up toggling a few screens just trying to extract information. So these are the things that can really indeed revolutionize how we address financial crime risk. But again, a lot of considerations need to go into the data set, the IT, etc., etc.
Yeah. So you make some really good points, Jeemeng. But I think it's a good segue to our next kind of question is that the technology to do things like OCR capture, and the rates that you're getting these days around accuracy of OCR, etc., is very high, right? You also have NLP with natural language processing that can kind of read date documents, etc., and then pull out the relevant information. But what we're seeing at the moment is the rate of adoption is still not as at least for me personally, it's not as high as it should be. Because maybe 10 years ago, it's like, oh, the technology doesn't exist, or it hasn't been verified, or the veracity of it is in question. But I think we're seeing regulators pushing, at least in this part of the world, to say, no, you need to get your reg tech in, you need to get your AI and machine learning in to kind of help solve it, because just throwing human beings at it is not really the appropriate kind of long-term solution. But what are some of the issues, maybe start with you, Luke, around that basically driving that adoption collectively as an industry? So what are some of the issues that you think are slowing us down from kind of really getting in there and kind of doing the adoption?
Yeah, happy to talk to that. I think there's obviously all of the aforementioned points that we already said about remediating data quality and the data lineage. There is a fair bit of work to be done before you can just sort of switch on a solution. I know some solutions do have that capability to ingest data from multiple sources, but to Jeemeng's point, it's super disappointing when you get in the room and you say, oh, you can solve someone else's problems, but not necessarily ours because of XYZ historical issues that we're yet to do. So there's that journey, but I don't think that's what you're getting at. I think you're more getting at the hesitancy that people have to rely on this. I think that generally speaking, there's a predisposition to wanting to stay the same and do the things that have always worked. One can question whether or not they have always worked, but the other thing is, I think explainability is going to be the main answer that anyone will tell you to this question. making this stuff is the technical term, making it explainable to a regulator so that you can say, oh, hey, this is my risk assessment. This is what I think I'm at in terms of the money laundering risk through my entity. And I've got this whiz-bang system over here. That's not enough. It's not a panacea. You can't just say, I've paid to implement a RegTech and the RegTech tells me that all these things are amazing. You need to really go on that journey and explain how and really understand the product. And I think that that's one challenge. The other challenge I'll say is people, for better or for worse, people are worried about regulators. So what I'd really like to see is more clear guidance. FATF has, for instance, FATF's not a regulator, but still they have a paper on machine learning and AI and all of that sort of stuff. I'd really like to see regulators lead by example and blue sky thinking here implement some AI and ML of their own in terms of ingesting the huge amount of reports that they get and lead with stories about that sort of thing to give the confidence to the industry to then turn around and say, well, hey, it's good enough for them. That's something I think would be really, really helpful.
No, I think, shots fired, Luke. So, hopefully the regulators are listening. Janet, I mean, in terms of, your thoughts on this and maybe also bringing that whole thing about moving away from things like 1, 3, 5-year periodic review cycles, so just kind of keen to hear your kind of views on this.
Yeah, so I mean, from a regulatory point of view, there's a couple of things. So there's definitely a push to move away from those static cycles, and that's a practical impossibility to do sort of without these sorts of technologies. You need to have them in place so you can get that continual review process ongoing. There's definitely a push worldwide regulatory as well that we're seeing in terms of that explainability piece, as Luke mentioned. It's becoming more and more prevalent. A lot of it is not full regulations yet. It's just proposals of the way it's going. And I think one of the challenges is really that you've got all of these big governmental institutions trying to come up with some good legislation, but it's not got the detail in order to give people confidence about what they really need to do. And in some respects, that's a good thing, because whenever you're looking at technologies, because they're changing so quickly, you don't want to be too detailed and prescriptive, because then the legislation will be quickly out of date. But at the same point, understanding what you have to comply with and what you can and cannot do is absolutely critical. So having some of those case studies and what's allowed in all the various regions would be really beneficial, because I think that is driving a lot of hesitancy. Even though people want to pick up these technologies because they need it to support one set of legislations, they then have all sorts of rules about explainability and ensuring that the systems themselves are regulated in some areas. That means that it can be difficult to know where to start. And I mean, again, on the explainability thing, it's something that's relatively new in the AI and ML space from an end user point of view. It's been around for a long time from data scientists' explanations, but that's not the sort of explanations we're talking about. You need to have something that a non-data scientist end user can understand, can write in that report when it goes for escalation. So you've got to have a different set of techniques, and it means that there's more pressure put on the companies like mine that are building these sort of tools to make sure that you've got that in place, because it's not easy to do, but you've got to think about it up front. Otherwise you don't get models with that level of detail in. And I think having that discussion with the people that are looking to adopt and looking at what their challenges are and why they're hesitant is absolutely critical, because there are ways around a lot of the hesitancy, and it's really good to have that open dialogue so that they can understand what they can do and how far the regulatory technology can take them.
No, that's very well explained, Janet. So over to you, Jeemeng, on your kind of views around the whole adoption of these kind of systems.
Yes, I guess it depends on financial institutions, but I guess a lot of this so-called resistance to change, right, could also stem from the fact that a lot of resources have been spent by financial institutions to build out certain processes the way they were, the way they are. And even from the perspective of cost optimization, especially in the Southeast Asian region, you will find that it is not uncommon for financial institutions to have basically offshore some parts of their so-called financial crime operations to another jurisdiction whereby the costs are lower, but of course in terms of literacy is high. But when you think about changing, for example, especially let's say you talk about pure name screening, you're going to change the process from basically having a pool of adjudicators, even you call them level 1 or 2, in somewhere out there, and you're going to replace, for example, hypothetically 50% of resources using systems. It means a lot of changes in a lot of things. Systems, it also means that you have got to do a lot of pre-planning as to how many office area you need, etc. And there are softer elements whereby, just imagine this hypothetically, right? I go bullish and say that I'm going to change, and I'm very confident that after my proof of concept and my proof of value, that the change in name screening, whereby it is actually using NLP as a means to recognize some of these things, will save a lot of time in terms of determining whether something should or should not be. But I'm going to inform the regulators in about 1 year's time by saying that, dear regulator, for your information, we are going to just let go 50% from this particular area. I guess from a regulatory perspective, there's going to be fear in the sense that what is happening, etc. So I guess, well, there are certain benefits definitely to be reaped from this. So I guess the collaboration with the regulator is important as they also push for AI. I think the thinking behind it is that there should be some, in fact, minuses and plus, whereby potentially things to get restructured, including, I wouldn't say it's redundancy, but it's a matter of how you redeploy your staff to do better things. Now, all these are real challenges. Yeah.
All right. So now the good point. Let's pause there for a second for our first poll question. And it's very much related to what you were saying, Jeemeng. So the poll question here is, if there's a ready-to-implement AI solution to help reduce false positives by, say, 20 to 50%, let's not go 90% because that's what some of the false positive rates are, would you adopt it? So, poll question to go out to the audience, please. And we'll just give them a few seconds to respond. Hopefully everyone says yes. Should get the, wait 1 second. All right, maybe we come back to the results of the poll in a bit's time. So maybe I think Luke, I mean, in terms of that question we were discussing before the poll is around the whole kind of operational efficiency, as I would put it, around using AI and ML. And as we were talking about earlier, is that if you can then get the machine to do your level 1 alerts, maybe it's the screening or transaction monitoring, or maybe even kind of look through all your fraud alerts, for example, and then kind of review that and look at a small portion that the human being can look at versus all of that. What are some of the kind of operational efficiencies or challenges that you would see in implementing AI and ML at this stage?
It's a good question. I think that when you want to undertake such a big project and really become a next level or a next era sort of risk manager, you want to do better than you've historically done, not more of the same. And although this is generally a pretty positive panel, and we're all probably quite bullish on AI and ML, my favorite saying about machine learning is, if all of machine learning's friends jumped off a bridge, would it? And unfortunately, the answer can be yes, depending on how it's implemented. So I think that you really need to have that. I think the operationally, you need to look at more, for instance, than you need to look at more data sources to define what good and success looks like. So, for instance, you wouldn't necessarily look at the transmission of fraud and binary things are quite easy because you'd say, well, that was fraud because the cardholder ended up telling us. But for instance, with a money laundering investigation and the complex area of transaction monitoring program, right? You wouldn't necessarily look to whether or not that alert has been closed and then teach the system, oh, that's been closed, because as Jeemeng and Chen have mentioned, you're relying already on human processes, people flicking through different systems, siloed information, and non-complete customer view. So you don't want to teach the AI or the machine learning model to replicate that. You want it to be better. And that's something really challenging to do, especially in the context of, as Jeemeng mentioned, that sometimes this will mean downsizing, or as I prefer the term, redeployment, because you really want, I think you want to be able to use AI and ML to do what you have been doing better. And so instead of think of it as cutting headcount, I'd really rather see institutions move in the space that I've seen them move so far, which is we can just do so much more and better and higher quality now with each human resource that we pay for. So I think that's operationally, that can be really difficult to tell that to get buy-in at that level, because people do fear things like redundancies, and also no one sort of wants to acknowledge that potentially there's been deficiencies in the human approach, because obviously we're all human. I don't want to hear that a computer can do my job better than me, and it can't necessarily in every case, but can it help us, and can it take a lot of that grunt work, sort of the really operational manual sort of stuff off, and let us do the beard stroking and really think, is this a bad guy, and think deeply about our customer as opposed to process alerts. That's where I think the benefit is, but also it can be really challenging to get buy-in for that message.
No, I understand. But so before we kind of go into to get Janet's views, I just want to give you the poll results. So yes was 47.9%, no was 8.3%, but there's more considerations to be factored in at 43%. So I don't think we've got a resounding yes, but at least it's in the right direction. So Janet, I mean, just kind of carrying on from what Luke was saying, just when you're looking at some of the kind of challenges that big organizations and boards are facing, where I think the paradigm has shifted, where like if you went and said, I got a remediation project, I need to now hire 500 people to do it. I think 10 years ago you might be okay, fine, it's a regulatory obligation, let's go do it. I think now you'd be challenged a little bit further around some of the technology elements that you can introduce, where you can reduce the number of people there. So keen to hear your thoughts from an operational perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of what Luke said really does ring true. Many institutions have already invested heavily in technology, but this space is moving so quickly that technology that was invested in 3-5 years ago does not necessarily have all the features that you need to support the efficiencies that AI and ML can bring right now. And you add into that some of the other changes that we've already discussed on this panel that you might need to bring in terms of going through the data that you've got, maybe checking all your paper records and getting those digitized. So you might then have to purchase a much better optical reader in order to get that information in. You might need to look at improving your data warehousing technologies and all the security levels and access levels around that before you can even put in something new. So it can be a much harder sell. And then that's even before you add in the fact that there may be nervousness around jobs. But I'm 100% with Luke's comment that this is taking that horrendous, the boring sort of constant draining work of looking through rows and rows of numbers. Yeah. And as humans, we're quite fallible, and you can get data blind very easily. If you're constantly looking at the same things, you can miss things. Or you can, just because of inherent mental bias, which we all have, things that seem interesting to you will pop out and you'll focus on those. at the expense of other things you should be looking at. And that's just because of how we are. It means that we can be more creative in other aspects, and we sometimes see things that maybe a computer algorithm might miss. But what we need to do is get it to the point, just like, I mean, like 20 years ago, you know, you didn't have the internet, and now we've got this amazing information at our fingertips. If someone asked me to do a research project then, it would be constant library work and it would take a lot longer. Whereas now you've got all of that information, and that's where we need to be with the financial crime space. We want to give these people who know what they're looking for all of the information at their fingertips very quickly. That then means that they can do those much richer reports. They can do more thorough research rather than churning through hundreds and hundreds of tasks on a day, most of which they just discount. And that then brings that worry that they may be discounting things that they shouldn't. So it is a hard sell, particularly with the rates of detection of financial crime, because it's regulatory, you've got to do it, but you can't necessarily show a really good return on investment because there's so much that's missed. You're just looking to do better. So one of the things that we try and focus on is efficiency and effectiveness. You're getting that detail, and you're also getting through those boring tasks a lot faster. From that point of view, it can be easier to build a case to get these new technologies in. But you do need to make sure that if you're pitching that to a senior level, that you get everything in order, so that you can answer all of those questions up front and show all the benefits that it will bring.
Well, thank you so much, Janet. I think, you know, we need, if I can summarize that, we need to bring, you know, AI and ML out of the Dewey Decimal System in libraries into, you know,
yeah,
the internet.
It needs to be easy. Yeah.
Right. So I think, you know, we've got a good 6 minutes left. So I really wanted to get into a little bit more of the practical elements of this. I think we've discussed quite a few topics around, you know, AI models and you know, the ability to kind of, you know, look at it from an operational context. We looked at data, but, you know, how would you look at, you know, building an AI and ML roadmap in your organizations? Because that's something that, you know, a lot of people struggle with is, right, I know I need to do this. I know the technology exists. I know all of this thing. And I think coming back to one thing to what Jeemeng said is that I've got a budget of X, but my book of work is 10X. I need to keep prioritizing. And I need to basically try and build that roadmap, but get my organizations to you know, an automated technology and efficient perspective. So maybe Jeemeng, I'm really keen to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, you can do it in many ways, right? But I just would have to cite what some practitioners, the pitfalls that they fall into, right? Firstly, I guess some practitioners fail to do a proper gap assessment. You can rush in to get vendors to do a presentation. You can even get some vendors who are happy to do a free proof of concept for X months or weeks, etc. But if you don't do a proper gap analysis as to what you are lacking, you will find it becomes very painful, because there are considerations for which you thought, you assume, but they're not true. Other things could also include in terms of the buy-in, right? But from a roadmap perspective, I guess, after having done your gap assessment, right, and most important, your proof of concept, I'm approaching this a little bit from a different perspective, from a sales perspective, because at the end of the day, someone needs to pay for the system, someone needs to pay for the license. So your proof of concept, to whichever vendor you choose ultimately, right, you need to pick the right battle to fight, because a successful proof of concept will demonstrate that because of this particular deployment, risks that we currently have or risks that are latent in our portfolio, which are not known previously, are being flagged, even if it's on a POC basis. Why not? But it will show to people that maybe we should change the way we are doing things, because the system brings about things. And that's when actually within X number of budget, you just have to plan within the next 1 to 3 years horizon how systematically you want to roll out the features. So it will never be a big bang, but it has to be a very targeted things, by saying that if you're focusing on, for example, on a name screening, what do we want to achieve 1 year later? When it comes to transaction surveillance, it's a little bit more complex because the portion that was talking about modeling, right? It is important for the organization. If you talk about explainability, right, the most basic form of explainability, even before it goes into the black box, is to really understand, right, what each technique, maybe it's network analysis, maybe it's certain kind of whichever kind of technologies you use. What are the limitations? What are the pros and cons? Only when you do this, right, you're able to say that if I implement it systematically across 6 months, 12 months, I'm able to see things on a progressive basis. But at the end of the day, yeah.
Thank you so much, Jeemeng.
Yes, correct.
Maybe Luke, just 30 seconds on your thoughts.
Yeah, I'll other than fixing issues with data, I would say that you need to look to your personnel internally and teach old dogs like me how to do new tricks and explain things properly. How to make sure that you have the capability not just to bring up to speed with what's now, because everybody here knows that what's current is outdated next month, and financial crime is always evolving. So you need to be able to have that governance to show this is how the system addresses our current needs, and this is also how we're going to have a really clear roadmap when a new typology report drops, when new financial crimes come out, when new data sources come, when new technologies like crypto, all of this sort of stuff. You need to have all of that so you can start the training journey even before you start the implementation, would be what I would say.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Janet?
Yeah, I'd echo both of those thoughts. You've got to have a good plan to go forward, and you've got to get your data right. You've got to make sure that whatever technology you're using is right for the problem you're solving, because that's one of the big problems that I see, is that people are trying to shoehorn in the wrong technologies to solve a specific problem, just down to misunderstanding. So there needs to be that education piece to make sure you're doing the right thing at the right time with the right data. And that's the critical step.
Thank you so much. We'll take final comments. We'll go to the last poll of the day for this session. So the poll is, would you be keen to explore how AI and machine learning can help you improve your KYC AML process? So while we're tabulating the poll, last 10 seconds on some predictions. So what do you think you're looking at from a future of AI and ML in KYC, onboarding, financial crime? Maybe start with you, Janet.
Oh, there's a lot coming up. So I think the thing to remember very quickly is that all of the bad actors in this space have their own data scientists, machine learning engineers, and they are actively working against us using the same technologies. So we need to be there and adopting and getting ahead. So we've touched on some of the technologies Jeemeng mentioned, but really diving into the deeper graph machine learning pieces, and particularly if we can coordinate between ourselves in order to see how things are flowing, because just because it gets to the boundaries of your information doesn't mean that it disappears. And the criminals are taking advantage of the fact that we have a boundary to where we can look. So I think in future we need to start stepping away from those boundaries and have greater information sharing. And then we also need to be on top of the technologies as they're coming through. There's an awful lot of really interesting research in the quantum ML space that I've been following at the moment, particularly on the broader networks, to really pinpoint how changes are coming through. It's not at a point yet that's ready to be implemented in most institutions, but I think in a few years' time we'll start seeing those things coming through.
All right, Janet. So we got maybe 10 seconds before we get kicked out. So 5 seconds, Luke.
I anticipate greater anticipation uptake of regtex, and then what I think is really important, the key message, is a flow-on effect to effective financial crime combating it and preventing it, reporting it, getting bad guys off the streets, disrupting the criminal enterprises.
Thanks, Luke. And Jeemeng, 5 seconds, final thoughts.
To sum up, I think for compliance officers, the main thing is avoid complacency. Full stop. Awesome. No, very good point. So the poll results are basically 86% will adopt, 13% will not. But with that, really, really excellent discussion. I certainly learned a lot. So thank you very much to our panelists
Janet, Jeemeng, and Luke, really appreciate the time, really appreciate the thoughts. Have an excellent day, and thank you so much for everyone who attended this panel as well. Cheers.